Lee Strobel's interviewee states that he has clear and definite proof that on the day of Jesus' execution, the sky turned dark and an earthquake followed, signifying God's victory. If this was true, it would seriously cause me to consider reconversion. But is there really evidence of this, or yet another fundamentalist making it up? Now, in Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ, in his interview with Dr. Edwin Yamauchi, I did an earlier video where Dr. Yamauchi stated that the illegitimacy of Jesus Christ was established from secular sources, including the Roman senator and historian Tacitus, the works of Josephus, and Pliny the Younger. And I mentioned in that video that his case completely fell short because yes, these secular historians did mention there was a Jesus and that people followed him and even died for him, but none of them really stated that they believed he was divine. And Dr. Yamauchi mentioned some other insignificant Jewish references in which he tried to prove his very weak case that the mere mentioning of a man by others somehow legitimizes his divinity and confirms all the miracles in his later resurrection. I found that very much nonsense from a man who is so highly educated, as he is, with not only a doctorate, but multiple fellowships he's participated in. This was nothing but mere speculation, and bad speculation at that. It was a typical fallacy of the fundamentalist, which seemed to be the only types that Lee Strobel interviews, of taking one truth and trying to create another truth. But the last part of the doctor's interview, he tried to put together evidence that would indeed establish Jesus as divine at the moment of his death on the crucifixion cross. And this was the gospel claim that at Christ's death, the sky turned dark and there was an earthquake signifying God's victory at the cross. Now, if I was a Roman soldier and I was assigned the detail to executing this man, putting nails in his hands and feet and watching him die, and at the moment of his death, the sky turned dark and there was an earthquake, that would be enough for me to desert the Roman army and head to the baptismal waters. And even 2,000 years later, if we could establish that this actually happened at the time of death of Christ, it would probably push me to those waters as well. Maybe that wouldn't be enough evidence for other non-believers, but for me, I would find the matter a little bit too coincidental. So in researching this tale, I had to address 3 points. I ended up down a series of rabbit holes, reading article after article from apologists and those who weren't to confirm or deny whether this fable was probable. The first would be, do we know the exact day that Jesus died? Now, if you read a few of my many sources from the apologists, they conclude emphatically that Christ died on April 3rd, 33 AD, and that the darkness ruled from the 6th to 9th hour, the biblical term for 12 to 3 in the afternoon. And Dr. Yamauchi seems to be convinced of exactly this. And this is what astounds me about the man with his level of education and his collection of fellowships he's attended. The general consensus of the scholars is that they do not know what day Jesus died or know the year exactly. It makes sense to them that he was probably executed in the afternoon, but most of them conclude that the year was probably somewhere between 30 and 33 AD. And I've read some who conclude it's 29 to 33 AD. So you have a 3 to 4 year spread in which Jesus Christ could have died. Now this is important, for if Strobel's interviewee is to have any validity in his claim whatsoever, he has to match the time of Jesus' death exactly with the time exactly where this darkness occurred, as well as the earthquake, so to speak. And right there, the general consensus is that they can't even match the year. But let's take a look at a second point. The supposed earthquake that tore the curtain of the temple in two. According to Bart Ehrman, the earthquake is only mentioned in one gospel, and that would be Matthew's. So the inconsistency of the gospels raises its ugly head again. Now, there have been earthquakes in the area. According to the German Research Center for Geosciences, under the study of Marcus Schwab and Achim Brauer, 3 cores from a beach adjacent to the Dead Sea were studied to see if past earthquakes had occurred there. They found in 31 BC there was a widespread earthquake. They also seem to conclude that there was a seismic event somewhere between 26 and 36 AD. In other words, they concluded it was big enough to do some damage, but not big enough to be widespread. That is a 10-year history when that earthquake could have occurred, and there is absolutely no way to determine if that seismic event happened during the day of Christ's execution, if we knew it, or even the year of his demise. Not to mention, other Jewish scholars, including Josephus, give no mention to a temple curtain being torn in half. It seems that this language was either symbolic, added by early church writers, who were probably not Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or the event didn't happen at all during the execution. But there's absolutely no way to correlate it, as Dr. Yamauchi seems to make it try to. He is literally making up evidence, again. The fact is, there was another Greek writer, Phlegon, who did record a great earthquake on the coast of the Black Sea, on what is now Turkey today, which supposedly caused great damage to the city of Nicaea. It was not correlated to Christ's execution. Dr. Yamauchi is making up evidence to fit his worldview once again. Now, the third point that we would have to correlate to Christ's death is the darkness that fell over the land from the 6th to 9th hour. And for this hypothesis, he quotes a writer of history, Julius Africanus, who wrote the work that Dr. Yamauchi studied back in 221 AD, a few hundred years after the execution of Jesus. And this is the stretch that Dr. Yamauchi tries to make. Africanus is quoting a man named Thales, who in approximately 52 AD wrote a history of the Eastern Mediterranean, where Thales states that there was an eclipse of the sun, which of course, if it happened during Christ's execution, and that's a long shot at best, but would explain the darkness that fell on the land. Well, Julius Africanus states that it couldn't have been an eclipse because Christ's execution was near the Passover and the moon would have been in the wrong position for the eclipse to have occurred. And Africanus is right. And that is confirmed by many scholars, fundamentalists and non-fundamentalists alike. So Africanus' point, which is the one that Dr. Yamauchi concurs with, is that since we can rule out it being an eclipse, it had to be a supernatural event. Well, here's the problem with this. Neither Africanus or Dr. Yamauchi can possibly know whether Thales was referring to Jesus' crucifixion, because the writings of Thales are lost, and Julius Africanus was associated with the church. Because again, this so-called darkness at the crucifixion wasn't mentioned by anyone else. It wasn't mentioned by Seneca, wasn't mentioned by Pliny, and again, it wasn't mentioned by Josephus or any other major historians. We don't know the time period that Thales was talking about, other than it was the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from 14 AD to 37 AD. That is a long stretch of time for that eclipse to have occurred, or whatever it was that Thales was talking about. Because Dr. Yamauchi is making a colossal jump in assuming he knows the exact day that Jesus died, has good confirmation that the earthquake happened on this day, at the hour he would have died, and that whatever darkness Thales was talking about fell upon the land at that exact moment as well. And William Lane Craig takes the exact same position that Dr. Yamauchi comes from. And guess what? William Lane Craig is a fundamentalist as well. And this is my problem with these guys. They have a hypothesis. It is far-fetched, it is not provable. As a matter of fact, it is not only not provable, but is highly unlikely. They have no supporting evidence from anyone else who's recorded these events. They are going back to what they're always going back to, and that's the Gospels being legitimate. And that's that it must be true because the Gospels said so. And that's weak in itself because those were written far after the fact and we don't know who wrote them anyway. And this is why I'm burning Lee Strobel to the ground. He has a background as an award-winning expert legal journalist, and an amateur journalist could have taken this apart easily. How come I can find all this inconclusiveness as someone who's not an expert legal journalist, but yet Lee couldn't? Because if you look at his references at the end of the chapter in the book The Case for Christ, they're all fundamentalists too. And this is why I accuse him of being a fraud. I do not believe he was an atheist when he did these interviews. And now as I conclude the third person he's interviewed, he continues to prove me correct. And if you'd like to see some more of Strobel going down in the hellfire flames he warns us of, check out my playlist card at the end screen. And I'll see you next time as we once again take that sword of reason and reality and thrust it right through the heart of ignorance.